Alright everyone, so if you have Miko's blessing, let's start this video. So a lot of you will find this video difficult because we're going to be using a bit of maths and spreadsheets, so if that's not your kind of thing, you're welcome to click off. I really don't mind. But for those of you that are staying, any technical feedback I'd appreciate in the comment section. So what we're going to do is we're going to be answering the question of how do you actually do proper artifact selection. So in this case, you can see here, I've got a Fevonia and Miko, and a lot of people have been in a very similar situation where they might say, well, out of all these other artifacts here, is there another artifact that I could swap out that'll give me better results? So conventional wisdom would say, well, to do that, what you'd need to do for each artifact is calculate what we call a CV. In other words, a critical value. So that is your crit rate substat multiplied by 2 plus your crit damage, and that gives you a value, in this case 32.6. And if this value is close to 40 or above, it's a good artifact. And if you've got another artifact that's got a higher crit value, in this case you can see here's an artifact with a crit value of that is actually above 40, you should always like swap to this artifact instead of this artifact. Now obviously there's a lot of nuance that is lost here, so critical values, as awesome as they are for giving you a general heuristic, they lack that nuance, and that's actually what I want to talk about today. So yes, obviously stuff like your overall DPS, your burst uptime, all these sorts of things, average damage per second, we get all those things. I mean, there's lots of nuance to this conversation that critical values just seem to swipe under the rug. And I think that the proper way to go about artifact selection is to have a systematic way of thinking about crit rate and crit damage, and more specifically, what does crit rate actually mean and how does it impact the damage that you do. So for me, the entire sort of problem of selecting one versus the other is kind of pointless in the context of a direct comparison. You should always go to the totality of your stats here and then compare this with any sort of artifact bonuses that might result as a consequence of swapping, and then you can put this into some sort of system to do a bit of calculations. And those calculations you will see right here in the spreadsheet. So for simplicity's sake, and this is just for those of you that want to follow along on the tutorial, what I've done is I've created two scenarios here. So scenario 1 says your base outgoing damage, which you can now account for resistance and everything else that you want, before doing crit damage is about 15,000 in this case. It can be whatever value you want. The value really doesn't matter. What you have then under your scenario 1 or your first set of artifacts is a total crit rate of 65 and 145, and basically this will give you an expected damage. You can see there's a little formula of about 29k, which is pretty okay. And obviously with any sort of statistical analysis, we also want to work out the variation in that damage. So for those of you guys that don't understand crit rate, it's very simple. Basically 65% of the time you will get the higher damage number 36,000, but 35% of the time you'll get the lower 15,000. So there's obviously a bit of variability, and we need to quantify that variability by giving a number on it. So the lower the number, the more consistent our damage. So in this case here you can see there is the standard deviation. So this is quite a bit of a high number, so there's lots of variability with regards to the average damage that we do. So obviously if I push this up to about 95, you can see the standard deviation has gotten quite a bit lower. So in this case you can obviously now appreciate that we're doing much more consistent damage. Right, so just back to where we were originally, you can see here that these are the analytical formulae. So if you guys want to copy this on your spreadsheets and follow along, you're welcome. And obviously we can more or less confirm these numbers by just doing a simulation. So here you can see I'm just pressing the little calculate now button. We're doing about 10,000 simulations. It's pretty easy. So there's the formula for doing the simulations. And then basically to get the average, you just sort of, well, average it out. And standard deviation is just standard deviation with the population in this case. So basically this sort of showcase here sort of demonstrates to you sort of how you can expect your damage to look like. And what's very interesting is you might start asking some questions like, what happens if I change my crit rate? So if you look at your crit rate, you can plot your crit rate versus the variability in the damage that you're going to do, and then you'll get this nice little sort of like upside down smiley face or parabola for those of you that, or like half circle, whatever, however you want to see it. And in essence, what this says is in the region of a 40 to 60% crit rate, there's lots of variability here. So when it comes to crit rate artifacts, if you can get your crit rate numbers very, very high, the effective variability in your outgoing damage is going to decrease quite significantly. So in a certain sense, there might be a bit of an argument to be made that increasing from a 50% crit rate to 60% whilst increasing your overall average damage might not really give you a better sort of play experience, because you still have like a high variance in terms of that damage. So hopefully that made sense. What you can see here on the second chart is the expected damage function or the expected damage that you can do as a function of your crit rate. So obviously, assuming everything else is constant here, you guys can see that the higher the crit rate, well, the higher the damage. But what you might not appreciate is that there's also a chance for you to do less than the average damage, and also a chance for you to do more than the average damage. Now, how did I actually do this? Well, the first thing I did is I coded up like about 10,000 simulations. You can see it, there's 10,000 going down. I got the crit rate values right here. They're just going to go across. And I then basically did a couple of simulations and so on. I calculated the expected damage and then the standard deviation. For those of you that want, you can abuse the, what's it called, the central limit theorem. And then, of course, just remember to truncate your interval, so you calculate the 75th percentile, the 25%, so you can calculate into quartile ranges, whatever. All these formulas are on screen, you can just pause for it, but in essence it's pretty easy to produce a chart like this. In essence, what it does tell you is that there is a region where there's lots of variability, so it's not always just a simple case of, oh yeah, this artifact set's got slightly more, you know, it's got slightly more crit rate or crit damage. The variability in the damage that you do actually does affect your play experience. So it is something that we don't do enough analysis on, and it's something that I can definitely do a deep dive if you guys want. But what I'm actually here to talk about is to say, well, assuming that under scenario 1, you've got all of these as base cases, what happens now if you swap out your artifacts? So let's say under scenario 2, you've got the Blizzard Stray artifact. So basically for practically about 40% of the time where you don't freeze the enemy, you'll get a lower crit rate of 35%. But when you do freeze an enemy, let's say you get like a 75% crit rate. In other words, it's defrozen, and if you hit a frozen target, you get additional 20%, blah, blah, blah. You guys know it. And let's say you've got Shenna or some other characters that increase your crit damage. So you've got variations on your crit damage. You can see here 70% of the time, I just sort of made this up, you get 135% crit damage, and obviously for 30% of the time you get like 185. We can, in very much the same vein as in scenario 1, now actually go and calculate the expected damage. We do this by running the scenario. So there is the formula bar for those of you that want to follow along and code this up yourself. So that's the formula I used. Run 10,000 scenarios. There's my expected damage, and there's the standard deviation. So appreciate this. You've got under scenario 1 less damage, like maximum damage. Under scenario 2, you are expected to do more damage. But what you can see is that on average, you are actually doing less. So even though your maximum is higher and you've got the same floor, you're doing slightly less damage with a higher variability. And this gives us our first proper statistical measure to assessing different artifact sets and like the different outputs, and that is you can just divide the expected damage by the standard deviation, and then you've got a dimensionless unit that you can now compare across two different scenarios. So in this case, you can see scenario 2 is actually giving me way less expected damage per unit of volatility, so therefore I would rather stick to artifact set 1. In this case, you might then ask yourself, well, what needs to change? What needs to change under scenario 2 for me to get like higher values? Well, this is where things become really practical, because how do you increase the uptime on your Blizzard Stray in this example? Well, it might have to do with how you do your rotation. So the way in which you practically play could influence some of these calculations, so you could adjust for it. You could do something like, for instance, adjusting the expected damage or the baseline damage for any additional things that we haven't talked about here, like energy recharge, burst uptime. All of these things you can adjust. You can adjust them for different scenarios. You run a simulation, and then you can get back your expected damage and standard deviation. The point is, there's lots of practical ways in which you can go about using these in-game stats, or the totality of these stats, under different artifact sets, and obviously the different playstyles those artifact sets imply, and then you can put them into a spreadsheet like this, and then you can calculate these statistics, and then obviously the final damage per unit of variability value, which you can see at the bottom here, and then you can compare different artifact sets in a more statistically meaningful way. So this is my way of sort of doing this. Obviously this is just a very simplistic example. You would typically run a full, or like a much better scenario, like the guys are doing at Genshin Sim, or I think it's DC Sim. So those guys are obviously running like a full team damage scenario, which I think is like way better. But when it comes to answering simplistic questions, just having a framework like this was certainly way better than just doing crit values and whatever those things might mean. And hopefully you guys can appreciate this. Because we're using a stochastic analysis and scenario sort of generation tool like this, we can now incorporate anything. We can incorporate any probability spreads of crit values. We can incorporate anything that might affect the base outgoing damage. So you could make this variable as well, and make this dependent on a lot of things. And in essence, what you do is you do a proper simulation, and your proper simulations can then be distilled into numbers that you can then compare your different artifact sets across. So for me, the whole thing of just comparing one artifact against another is kind of pointless. You need to look at the overall damage. You need to look at the overall sort of bonuses, what they imply about the different playstyles, map this back to what's in your calculator, and then of course run the simulations and then compare these things as to how they would play out on average. And of course, skill can definitely affect these calculations. But yeah, that has been a mouthful. I know this might be a bit of a difficult video to follow along and so on, but that is how you properly compare different artifact sets, or at least what I would think would be the bare minimum you'd need to do.